Millionaire enters diner and freezes when he sees his pregnant ex-wife working as a waitress. What happened in the end left everyone shocked. She stood there trembling, both hands gripping the tray so tight her knuckles had turned white. 7 months of pregnancy weighing heavy on her swollen feet as she approached table 12. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Rachel Thompson had served hundreds of customers in the past 4 months at Mel's downtown diner, smiling through exhaustion, pretending the ache in her lower back didn't exist, doing whatever it took to survive. But nothing could have prepared her for who was sitting in that corner booth on this ordinary Thursday afternoon. When she finally looked up from her notepad and saw his face, the entire world seemed to tilt sideways, her breath catching somewhere between her lungs and her throat. Michael Bradford sat there in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the kind that cost more than she made in 3 months, completely absorbed in whatever business deal he was discussing on his phone. He hadn't noticed her yet, hadn't seen the woman he'd thrown out of his life 2 years ago now standing 3 feet away, pregnant and desperate. The diamond Rolex on his wrist caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, a painful reminder of everything she'd lost, everything that used to be hers too. Rachel's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where baby Emma had been kicking all morning, as if somehow protecting her daughter from the man who once promised Rachel the world, and then took it all away. Michael's date sat across from him, a stunning brunette in her mid-20s who couldn't stop laughing at whatever he was saying, touching his arm in that familiar way Rachel remembered doing herself once upon a time. The woman wore designer everything, from her Prada handbag to her Christian Louboutin heels, the kind of accessories Michael loved buying for the women in his life. Rachel looked down at her stained white uniform, at the sensible shoes she'd bought at a discount store, at the name tag that read, "Rachel, happy to serve you," and felt something crack open inside her chest. This wasn't supposed to be her life, standing here with swollen ankles and a minimum wage job, serving the man who used to give her credit cards with no limits. The bells above the diner's entrance chimed as more customers walked in, and the sound finally made Michael glance up from his phone. Their eyes met for exactly 3 seconds, 3 impossible seconds where time seemed to stop completely. Rachel watched recognition flood across his face, watched his confident smile freeze and then shatter, watched him go pale despite his expensive Florida tan. His phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the table. The brunette looked confused, following Michael's stare until she too was looking at Rachel, at the pregnant waitress who had somehow stolen her date's complete attention. "Can I take your order?" Rachel heard herself say, her voice coming out steadier than she felt, years of survival instinct kicking in to save her from collapsing right there on the sticky diner floor. She gripped her pen like a lifeline, focusing on the small notepad in her hands instead of Michael's shocked expression, instead of the 1,000 questions she could see forming in his eyes. But her hands betrayed her, trembling just enough for the pen to slip slightly, and she knew he noticed, knew he saw everything he'd reduced her to. The brunette was talking now, saying something about wanting the Caesar salad, but Rachel couldn't hear anything over the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, over the memories of their last fight 2 years ago, when Michael had screamed that he never wanted to see her face again. "I'll have the steak medium rare," Michael said, his voice coming out rough and unfamiliar even to himself. He couldn't stop staring at Rachel's belly, at the way her uniform stretched across it, at the reality that she was carrying someone else's child. The brunette, whose name was Jennifer, kept looking between them with growing suspicion, her manicured nails tapping impatiently on the table. Rachel scribbled down the order without meeting his eyes, her pen moving across the paper in quick, efficient strokes that spoke of months of practice doing exactly this. Michael's mind was racing through calculations he didn't want to make. 7 months pregnant meant she'd gotten pregnant almost a year after their divorce, almost a year after he'd told her she was the biggest mistake of his life. The guilt hit him like a freight train, remembering how he'd forced her to sign papers giving up any claim to his money, how he'd made sure she left with nothing but the clothes on her back. He'd been so angry back then, so convinced she'd betrayed him, so determined to punish her for sins he wasn't even sure she'd committed anymore. "Is there something going on here?" Jennifer asked, her voice sharp with the kind of jealousy that came from sensing competition. Michael tore his eyes away from Rachel and looked at his date, this woman he'd been seeing for 3 weeks, this woman whose last name he couldn't remember right now if his life depended on it. Everything about Jennifer suddenly seemed fake, from her practiced laugh to her strategic touches, Nothing like the genuine warmth Rachel used to have. He'd been dating women like Jennifer for 2 years now, beautiful and shallow, never asking for more than expensive dinners and weekend trips to the Hamptons. She's nobody, Michael said automatically, and immediately hated himself for it. He watched Rachel's shoulders stiffen, watched her take a small step back like he'd physically slapped her. Those 2 words hung in the air between them, heavy with cruelty, with the same dismissiveness he'd perfected during their divorce. Rachel's hand tightened around her notepad, and for a second Michael thought she might throw it at his face, might cause the scene he probably deserved. "I'll get your order in right away," Rachel said quietly, her voice carefully neutral, professionally detached in a way that hurt worse than if she'd screamed at him. She turned to walk away, moving slowly because of the pregnancy, one hand supporting her lower back. Michael watched her go, watched her stop at another table to refill coffee cups, watched her smile at an elderly couple like her world wasn't falling apart. He knew that smile, had seen it 1,000 times during their marriage when she was hiding pain, pretending everything was fine when it absolutely wasn't. Jennifer was talking about some charity gala she wanted him to take her to next month, but Michael heard maybe one word in 10. His eyes kept following Rachel around the diner, cataloging every detail he'd missed in those first shocking seconds. She'd lost weight everywhere except her belly, her cheeks hollower than he remembered, dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. The Rachel he'd known had been vibrant, always laughing, always finding joy in small things. This Rachel looked exhausted, like she was running on nothing but determination and caffeine. A large man at the counter snapped his fingers at Rachel, demanding ketchup in a tone that made Michael's jaw clench. He watched her hurry over with a bottle, watched her apologize for something that wasn't her fault, watched her accept the man's rudeness with grace she shouldn't have to show. This was Rachel Thompson, who had a business degree from Columbia, who used to manage charity events that raised millions, now taking abuse from strangers over condiments. Michael felt rage building in his chest, not at the rude customer, but at himself, at what he'd done to her. "Michael, are you even listening to me?" Jennifer's annoyed voice cut through his thoughts. He looked at her and suddenly couldn't remember why he'd asked her out in the first place, couldn't remember what they'd talked about on their previous dates. She was beautiful, sure, but so were mannequins in store windows. There was nothing behind her eyes when she looked at him, nothing real, nothing that came close to what he'd had with Rachel before he'd destroyed it all with his paranoia and accusations. "I need to use the restroom," Michael said abruptly, standing up so fast he almost knocked his water glass over. He didn't wait for Jennifer's response, just walked across the diner toward where Rachel was placing an order at the kitchen window. She saw him coming and her whole body tensed, like prey spotting a predator. Michael's heart was pounding, his mouth dry, because what do you say to the woman whose life you ruined when you find her like this? "Rachel, we need to talk," he said when he reached her, keeping his voice low so other customers wouldn't hear. She kept her back to him, still writing something on her order pad, her shoulders rigid. When she finally turned around, the look in her eyes was pure ice, nothing like the warmth that used to be there when she looked at him. This was a stranger wearing Rachel's face, a survivor who'd learned the hard way not to trust men who promised forever. "There's nothing to talk about, Michael," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper but sharp enough to cut. She tried to move past him, but he stepped into her path, immediately regretting it when he saw fear flash across her face. He'd never scared her before, never given her reason to flinch, and the fact that she did now told him exactly how far they'd fallen. Behind them, Jennifer was watching with narrowed eyes, probably planning to make a scene the second Michael returned to the table. "Please, just 5 minutes." Michael heard himself beg, a tone he hadn't used in years, not since he'd built his real estate empire and learned that begging showed weakness. Rachel looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing options, calculating risks. The baby kicked visibly against her uniform, and both of them looked down at the movement. Something in Michael's chest twisted painfully, seeing this life growing inside her, this child that would never be his. "My shift ends at 6, Rachel finally said, exhaustion winning over pride. "There's a park 2 blocks east. I'll give you 10 minutes. Not 5. 10. Then you leave me alone forever." Before Michael could respond, the manager appeared, a heavy-set man in his 50s with suspicious eyes. He looked at Michael, then at Rachel, clearly trying to figure out if there was a problem he needed to handle with force. "Tell me in the comments, what would you do in this situation? If you were Michael, would you try to win back your pregnant ex-wife? Or would you let bygones be bygones? And if this story is affecting you, leave a like, because what happens next will surprise you even more. Rachel gave the manager a reassuring nod, and Michael took the hint. Walking back to his table where Jennifer was seething, he sat down, already planning how to end this date as quickly as possible, how to get through the next 4 hours until he could meet Rachel in that park. Jennifer started interrogating him about who Rachel was, but Michael barely heard the questions, his mind already racing ahead to what he would say, how he would explain everything, whether there was any chance of fixing what he'd broken so completely. The steak arrived, but Michael couldn't eat, couldn't taste anything, could only watch Rachel move through the diner like a ghost of the woman he'd married. Jennifer eventually stormed out after he ignored her for the 3rd time, leaving him sitting alone in the booth with an untouched meal. He stayed there for 4 hours, ordering coffee after coffee, watching Rachel work, seeing how she winced when she thought no one was looking, how she'd pause to catch her breath. At 5:45, Rachel disappeared into the back room and emerged 10 minutes later in regular clothes, a worn maternity dress that had probably cost $20 at most. She saw Michael still sitting there, and something like resignation crossed her face. He left a $200 bill on the table for a $30 meal and followed her out, keeping a respectful distance. The late afternoon sun hit them both as they walked silently toward the park she'd mentioned. The park was small, just a few benches and some struggling trees, nothing like the manicured gardens around Michael's penthouse. Rachel sat down heavily on a bench, one hand automatically going to support her back. Michael sat beside her, leaving a careful foot of space between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, just sat there listening to traffic and distant sirens, the soundtrack of a city that kept moving no matter how many lives fell apart. "How did this happen, Rachel?" Michael finally asked, gesturing at her belly, at her situation, at everything. She laughed, but there was no humor in it, just bitterness that sounded wrong coming from someone who used to find joy in everything. She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, survived too much, and Michael realized she was stronger now than she'd ever been when they were married. "How did this happen?" Rachel repeated. "Well, Michael, when two people love each other very much," she trailed off, shaking her head. "Actually, no. When two lonely people find comfort in each other for a few months, sometimes accidents happen. Is that the biology lesson you wanted? Or are you asking how I ended up serving burgers for $8 an hour?" Michael felt the sarcasm like a punch. This wasn't the Rachel he remembered, the sweet woman who never raised her voice, who always tried to see the best in people. 2 years of surviving alone had given her edges he'd never seen before, sharp corners where there used to be softness. He deserved this treatment, deserved worse actually, but it still hurt to see what his cruelty had helped create. "I'm asking about all of it," he said honestly. "I need to understand what happened to you after us." Rachel looked away, watching a mother push a toddler on the swings across the playground. Her hand moved unconsciously to her belly, and Michael wondered if she was thinking about her own daughter's future, about pushing Emma on swings someday. The sun was starting to set, painting everything in orange and gold, making the moment feel almost unreal. "What happened was exactly what you wanted to happen, Michael," Rachel said quietly. "I left your life completely. No contact, no alimony, nothing. You made sure of that." She was right. Michael had used the best lawyer's money could buy to make sure Rachel walked away with nothing, convinced himself she deserved it after what he thought she'd done. Now he couldn't even remember clearly what he'd accused her of, just a mess of suspicions and paranoia that had made sense at the time. "I was wrong." The words felt inadequate, too small for the damage he'd caused. Rachel turned to look at him, really look at him, and Michael saw tears gathering in her eyes that she refused to let fall. She'd learned not to cry in front of people, he realized, learned to save her tears for when she was alone, because showing weakness in her new life probably meant getting hurt. "Wrong about what exactly?" Rachel asked, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "Wrong about accusing me of cheating with your business partner when I was just helping him plan your surprise birthday party? Wrong about calling me names I won't repeat? Wrong about making me sign away any right to anything we built together? Which part were you wrong about, Michael?" Each question hit Michael like a bullet, bringing back memories he'd tried to bury under 2 years of work and meaningless relationships. He remembered now, remembered how convinced he'd been that Rachel and Thomas were having an affair, how the evidence seemed so clear, how he'd refused to listen to her explanations. Thomas had quit the company, moved to Seattle, and only then did Michael learn about the surprise party Rachel had been planning, about the texts he'd misinterpreted so completely. All of it, Michael said, his voice cracking. I was wrong about everything. Thomas called me 6 months after you left, told me the truth about the party, about how I'd destroyed the best thing in my life for nothing. Rachel's face went pale, then red, her hands clenching into fists. Michael could see her processing this, understanding that he'd known the truth for 18 months and never tried to find her, never apologized, never made it right. You knew, she whispered, the words coming out strangled. You knew for a year and a half that you ruined my life for nothing, and you did nothing about it. She stood up abruptly, or tried to, but the pregnancy made her movements awkward. Michael reached out to help her, and she slapped his hand away with surprising force. The sound of it echoed across the empty park, a sharp crack that perfectly captured everything broken between them. Rachel, please, I didn't know how to find you. Michael tried, but even he could hear how weak the excuse sounded. The truth was he'd been too proud to look, too ashamed to face what he'd done, so he'd buried himself in work and convinced himself it was better this way. Rachel was looking at him with such contempt that Michael wanted to disappear, wanted to go back in time and do everything differently. I was at my sister's house in Brooklyn, Rachel said coldly. Same place I'd been visiting every Sunday for 5 years. You knew exactly where to find me if you'd wanted to. But you didn't want to, did you, Michael? Because then you'd have to admit you were wrong, and God forbid Michael Bradford ever admits he made a mistake. The venom in her voice was earned, every drop of it, and Michael had no defense. Who's the father? Michael asked, immediately regretting the question when Rachel's expression turned even colder. It wasn't his business, had no right to know, but jealousy was eating him alive thinking about Rachel with someone else. She crossed her arms over her chest, protective, defensive, like she was shielding herself from him and everything he represented. The playground behind them was empty now, the mother and toddler gone home, leaving them alone with the weight of their history. His name was David, Rachel said finally. Was, past tense because he's not in the picture anymore. She sat back down, the anger seeming to drain out of her, leaving only exhaustion. Michael sat too, carefully, like she might bolt if he moved too fast. The space between them on the bench felt like an ocean, unbridgeable, filled with all the things they should have said to each other 2 years ago. He left when I told him about the pregnancy. Rachel continued, her voice flat, emotionless in a way that told Michael she'd cried all her tears about this already. We were only together for 4 months, nothing serious. He was honest, at least. Said he wasn't ready to be a father, didn't want the responsibility. So he left, moved to California. Sends a check sometimes. Small ones, but that's it. Michael felt rage building, not at Rachel, but at this David who'd abandoned her. He just left you pregnant and alone? The hypocrisy of his own outrage wasn't lost on him, considering he'd done essentially the same thing. Left Rachel with nothing when she needed him most. But at least he'd had the excuse of thinking she'd betrayed him. David apparently just didn't want to be inconvenienced. He did exactly what he said he would do. Rachel defended him, which somehow made it worse. He was clear from the start that he didn't want kids, didn't want commitment. I'm the one who got careless, who let the birth control lapse. This is on me. Michael hated hearing her blame herself, hated that she'd been so beaten down by life that she thought David's abandonment was somehow her fault. None of this is on you, Michael said firmly. He's a coward, and I'm sorry you had to go through that alone. Rachel looked at him with something like surprise, like kindness from him was so unexpected she didn't know how to process it. The sun was almost gone now, streetlights flickering on around the park, casting long shadows across the worn grass. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked, normal sounds of evening in the city, while Michael's world was turning upside down. Why are you here, Michael? Rachel asked tiredly. Why did you want to talk? What possible good can come from dragging up our past? It was a fair question, one Michael had been asking himself since he'd seen her in that diner. What did he want? To apologize, to ease his guilt, to try again? All of those things, and none of them seemed adequate. Because seeing you today broke something open inside me, Michael admitted, the honesty making him feel exposed. Because I spent 2 years convincing myself I was over you, that the divorce was the right choice, that I was better off. But one look at you, and I knew I'd been lying to myself. Rachel was shaking her head before he even finished, already rejecting what he was trying to say. Don't, she said sharply. Don't do this, Michael. Don't come into my life now with your guilt and your regrets. I've built something here, something small and hard, but it's mine. I'm surviving. I'm going to have my daughter and raise her right and maybe someday find my own happiness. But that can't include you. Every word was like a door slamming shut, and Michael felt panic rising because he was losing her all over again. I still love you. The words came out desperate, raw, nothing like the controlled businessman Michael had become. Rachel stood up again, this time managing it without his help, and looked down at him with an expression he couldn't read. Behind her, the diner's neon sign glowed in the distance, a reminder of the life she'd been living while he built his empire on the ashes of their marriage. You don't love me, Michael, Rachel said quietly. You love the idea of saving me, of fixing what you broke. But I'm not a project, I'm not some charity case for you to feel better about. I'm a real person who you destroyed, and love doesn't survive that kind of damage. She started walking away, one hand supporting her back, moving slowly toward the bus stop on the corner. Michael jumped up and followed her, his heart racing. Then let me prove it, he called out. Let me prove I've changed, that I can be what you need. Rachel stopped walking but didn't turn around, her shoulders tense. A bus was approaching in the distance, its headlights cutting through the growing darkness. Michael knew once she got on that bus, he might never see her again. How? Rachel asked, still not turning. How do you prove something like that, Michael? With money. I don't want your money. With promises? Your promises don't mean anything to me anymore. With time? I don't have time. I have a baby coming in 8 weeks. I have bills I can barely pay. I have a life that's hard enough without you complicating it. The bus was getting closer, maybe 30 seconds away. Then let me help, Michael said desperately. Not as your ex-husband, not as someone trying to get back together, just as someone who owes you more than he can ever repay. Rachel finally turned around, and in the streetlight, Michael could see tears streaming down her face now, the ones she'd been holding back finally breaking through. The sight of them gutted him, knowing he was the cause of so much of her pain. You want to help? Rachel's voice was thick with tears. Then leave me alone, Michael. Let me heal. Let me build a life for my daughter without having to look at your face and remember everything you put me through. That's how you help. You disappear. The bus pulled up with a screech of brakes, its doors opening. Rachel turned and climbed the steps slowly, carefully, one hand on the rail for support. Michael stood frozen on the sidewalk as the bus pulled away, Rachel's face visible through the window, looking straight ahead, refusing to look back at him. The taillights disappeared around a corner, and suddenly Michael was alone in the dark, feeling more lost than he'd felt in years. His phone buzzed with messages from Jennifer, angry texts demanding an explanation, but he deleted them without reading. None of that mattered anymore. He walked for hours that night through neighborhoods he'd never visited despite living in the city for 15 years. He saw other diners like the one where Rachel worked, saw pregnant women struggling with grocery bags, saw the version of life that existed outside his penthouse bubble. By the time Michael got home at midnight, he'd made a decision. He couldn't force Rachel to forgive him, couldn't demand a second chance, but he could make sure she and her daughter had the stability they deserved. The next morning, Michael called his lawyer. I need you to set up a trust fund, he said without preamble. $500,000 for a child who isn't mine yet, with Rachel Thompson as the trustee. I want it structured so she can't refuse it, can't send it back. It goes to the child's education, health care, whatever they need. The lawyer asked questions, wanted details, but Michael didn't want to explain. He just wanted it done. Then he called his company's HR director. We have an opening in the administrative department, right? Executive assistant to the CFO. When she confirmed, Michael continued. I want you to interview Rachel Thompson. Here's her number. Don't tell her I sent you. Just call her. Tell her you found her resume online, that you think she'd be perfect for the position. The director hesitated, confused, but agreed. Finally, Michael did the hardest thing. He wrote Rachel a letter, not an email, an actual handwritten letter on real paper. He told her everything he should have said 2 years ago. Every apology, every regret, every truth he'd been too proud to admit. He told her about the trust fund, about the job opportunity, about how none of it came with strings. And at the end, he wrote the truest thing he'd ever written in his life. I don't expect you to forgive me. the letter said. I don't even expect you to read this whole thing, but I need you to know that seeing you yesterday changed everything for me. Not because I want to get back together, though I won't lie and say I don't want that someday, but because I finally understood what I threw away, what I destroyed with my pride and paranoia. You deserved so much better than what I gave you, Rachel. You deserved trust and respect and unconditional love, and I gave you accusations and anger and abandonment. So this is my promise to you now. No strings attached. I will make sure you and Emma are taken care of. Not because I expect anything in return, but because it's the least I can do after everything I put you through. You were right yesterday. The best way I can help is to leave you alone. So that's what I'm going to do. I won't show up at your work again. I won't call. I won't try to force my way back into your life. But please accept the help I'm offering for Emma's sake. She doesn't deserve to suffer because of my mistakes. Neither do you. I hope someday you can find happiness again, even if it's not with me. Love always, Michael. He mailed the letter and spent the next 3 days in a state of constant anxiety, checking his phone obsessively for any response. None came. The lawyer confirmed the trust fund was established. The HR director reported that Rachel had accepted the interview and seemed shocked when she heard about the salary, $65,000 a year with full benefits. But from Rachel herself, nothing. No call, no text, no acknowledgement that she'd even received his letter. Michael threw himself into work, trying to distract himself from constantly wondering what Rachel was thinking, if she hated him more now, or if maybe, just maybe, she understood what he was trying to do. He turned down every social invitation, every date request from women in his circle, unable to imagine being with anyone who wasn't Rachel. His business partners noticed the change, how he'd suddenly become focused entirely on work, how the smooth charm he usually displayed had been replaced by grim determination. 2 weeks after sending the letter, Michael was in his office late at night when security called up. "Sir, there's a woman here to see you. Says her name is Rachel Thompson. Should I send her up?" Michael's heart stopped, then started racing double time. He managed to say yes, then spent the 90 seconds it took for the elevator to reach his floor, trying to prepare himself for whatever she'd come to say. Rachel walked into his office looking different than she had at the diner. She wore one of the new business outfits she must have bought for her job interviews, a maternity dress that was professional but kind compared to the stained uniform. Her hair was pulled back, makeup carefully applied, but her eyes were red like she'd been crying. Michael stood up from his desk, every muscle tense, not daring to hope this visit meant anything good. "I got your letter," Rachel said, standing just inside the doorway like she might run any second. "And I got the call about the job, and my sister, who's a lawyer, told me about the trust fund you set up." She paused, one hand on her belly where Emma was probably sleeping, unaware of the tension in the room. Michael stayed where he was, giving her space, letting her control this conversation. "I came here to tell you that I can't accept any of it," Rachel continued, and Michael's heart sank. "I can't take your money. I can't take the job. I can't let you buy your way out of guilt." She crossed the room slowly and placed an envelope on his desk. "So I'm giving it all back. The trust fund papers, the job offer, all of it." Michael looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "The money isn't for you," he said carefully. "It's for Emma. She didn't do anything wrong. She deserves opportunities, deserves education, deserves health care. You can hate me forever, Rachel, but don't punish your daughter for my sins." He watched her face, saw the conflict there, the mother's instinct to provide for her child warring with her pride. "I can provide for my daughter myself," Rachel said, but her voice wavered. "I don't need your charity." She was crying now, silent tears running down her face, and Michael wanted desperately to comfort her but knew she wouldn't accept his touch. The city glittered behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows, millions of lights representing millions of lives, and somewhere in all of that, Rachel had been surviving alone while he lived in luxury. "It's not charity," Michael said gently. "It's restitution. It's me finally doing something right after doing everything wrong." He picked up the envelope and held it out to her. "But if you really want to refuse it, I can't stop you. I promised I wouldn't force anything on you, and I meant that." Rachel stared at the envelope in his hand, clearly torn. "Why did you set up the trust fund before you even knew if I'd forgive you?" she asked. "Why do all this with no guarantee of getting anything in return?" It was the question Michael had been asking himself, and he'd finally figured out the answer in the 2 weeks since he'd seen her last. Because whether you forgive me or not doesn't change what I owe you, Michael said honestly. I took away your security, your stability, your faith in people. I can't give back what I took, but I can make sure your daughter never suffers like you did. That matters regardless of whether you and I ever speak again after tonight. He set the envelope back on his desk, leaving it there between them like a test. Rachel walked to the window, looking out at the city, one hand pressed against the glass. Michael stayed by his desk watching her, memorizing the way she looked silhouetted against the lights, in case this was the last time he ever saw her. Minutes passed in silence, just the distant sound of traffic and the soft hum of the building's air conditioning. Finally, Rachel spoke without turning around. Your letter, she said quietly. It was the first real apology I've ever gotten from you. The first time you actually took responsibility instead of making excuses. She turned to face him, and in the dim light of his office, Michael could see something in her expression he hadn't seen before. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the possibility of it someday, like a door that wasn't quite closed anymore. I accepted the job, Rachel admitted. I start Monday. The salary alone is more than I made in 6 months at the diner. And my sister said the trust fund is legally binding, that Emma gets it when she turns 18 no matter what I do. Michael felt something like hope blooming in his chest, dangerous and fragile. But that doesn't mean I forgive you, Michael. It doesn't mean we're okay. I know, Michael said. And he did know, understood that some damages couldn't be undone with money or gestures. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to make sure you knew that I'm sorry, truly sorry, for everything I put you through. Rachel nodded slowly, processing his words, maybe believing them for the first time. Emma kicked for the first time today, Rachel said suddenly, changing the subject. Right in the middle of my interview with your HR director. I think she was excited about the health insurance. It was almost a joke, the first one Rachel had made in his presence in over 2 years, and Michael felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. This small moment of shared lightness felt more precious than all the expensive gifts he'd ever given her. Can I? Michael asked, gesturing toward her belly, then immediately regretted asking when he saw her stiffen. I'm sorry, that was inappropriate, I have no right. But Rachel surprised him by stepping closer, taking his hand and placing it on the curve of her stomach. They stood like that, connected by his palm against where Emma was sleeping, and Michael felt something shift inside him, some piece of his heart that had been locked away clicking back into place. Emma kicked, a small flutter against Michael's hand, and he laughed despite the tears he didn't know were falling. She's strong, he said, his voice breaking. Just like her mom. Rachel didn't pull away immediately, let him feel another kick, another sign of life that had nothing to do with him, but somehow felt like a second chance anyway. When she finally stepped back, Michael's hand felt cold, empty. I should go, Rachel said, but she didn't move toward the door. My sister's waiting downstairs to drive me home. Still, she stood there looking at Michael like she was trying to reconcile the man who'd destroyed her life with the man who'd just cried feeling her daughter kick. Michael understood that confusion because he was feeling it too, trying to bridge the gap between who he'd been and who he wanted to become. Thank you, Michael said, for coming here tonight, for accepting the job and the trust fund, for letting me feel Emma kick. You didn't owe me any of that. Rachel smiled, small and sad, a smile that acknowledged how broken everything between them was but didn't quite give up hope that maybe someday it could be fixed. She picked up her purse and walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. My sister thinks I'm crazy, Rachel said without turning around. She thinks I should take your money and run, never speak to you again, protect myself and Emma from any chance of you hurting us again. Michael's heart sank, knowing her sister was probably right that the smart thing was for Rachel to cut him out completely. But then Rachel turned around, and there were tears streaming down her face again. But the thing is, Rachel continued, her voice shaking, I spent 2 years hating you, 2 years trying to erase every memory, trying to convince myself I never loved you at all, and I couldn't do it, Michael. Even after everything you put me through, even knowing what you're capable of when you're angry or scared or paranoid, I couldn't stop loving you. The confession hung between them, terrifying and honest. Everything Michael had hoped to hear but never expected. I don't expect us to just pick up where we left off, Rachel said quickly, like she needed to set boundaries before he got the wrong idea. I don't even know if I can fully forgive you, If I can ever trust you again completely. But maybe. She paused, taking a shaky breath. Maybe we can start over. Slowly. As friends first. See if the people we've become in these 2 years can build something better than what we had before. Michael crossed the room before he could think better of it, stopping just inches from Rachel, close enough to see every detail of her face, the hope and fear battling in her eyes. I will spend every single day for the rest of my life proving I've changed, he promised. I will never again let pride or jealousy or fear make me hurt you. I will love your daughter like she's mine, and I will love you the way I should have from the beginning. Rachel reached up and touched his face, her hand gentle against his cheek, and Michael closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of her touch. Don't make promises you might not keep, she whispered. Just show me, day by day, moment by moment. That's all I need. Michael covered her hand with his, holding it against his face like a lifeline, like the most precious thing he'd ever been given. I will, he promised again. Starting tomorrow, starting right now, I will show you. Rachel stood on her tiptoes, awkward because of the pregnancy, and kissed his cheek softly. It wasn't romantic, wasn't a promise of reconciliation, just a gesture of possibility, of doors opening that had been locked for 2 years. When she pulled back, Michael saw something in her eyes he thought he'd destroyed forever. Hope. I really do need to go now, Rachel said. My sister will think you kidnapped me. She smiled when she said it, a real smile, and Michael felt like he could breathe properly for the first time since their divorce. He walked her to the elevator, pushed the button, stood beside her in comfortable silence as they waited. When the elevator arrived and she stepped inside, she looked back at him one more time. See you Monday? She asked, and Michael nodded, not trusting his voice. I'll be in the West Wing, 3rd floor, if you want to say hi. The elevator doors started closing and Michael put his hand out to stop them one more time. Rachel looked at him questioningly, waiting to hear whatever last thing he needed to say. Michael took a deep breath and said the only thing that mattered. I love you, Rachel Thompson. I never stopped, and I never will. Rachel's eyes filled with tears again, but she was smiling through them, a bittersweet smile that acknowledged all the pain and all the possibility existing in the same moment. I love you too, she whispered as the doors finally closed. That's what scares me most. Michael stood there long after the elevator descended, staring at the closed doors, his hand still extended where it had stopped them. His security guard found him like that 20 minutes later, standing motionless in the hallway, and asked if he was all right. Michael just nodded, unable to explain that he'd just been given something he thought he'd lost forever. Not Rachel back, not yet, maybe not ever completely, but a chance. A fragile, terrifying, beautiful chance. That Monday, Michael arrived at his office 2 hours early, nervous as a teenager on a first date. He'd practiced what he'd say to Rachel when he stopped by her desk, rehearsed casual greetings that wouldn't sound desperate or pushy. But when he actually saw her through the glass walls of the West Wing, sitting at her new desk arranging family photos and a small plant, all his preparation vanished. She looked up, caught him staring, and waved. Just a simple wave, but it felt like forgiveness starting to bloom. The months that followed weren't easy. Rachel maintained careful boundaries, and Michael respected every single one. They had coffee sometimes in the break room, talked about work and weather and safe topics that didn't dig too deep into old wounds. Michael met her sister, endured the suspicious interrogation, earned grudging approval through patience and consistency. He showed up day after day, proving through actions instead of words that he'd meant everything he'd said that night in his office. When Emma was born 8 weeks later, Rachel called him from the hospital at 3 a.m. She's here, Rachel said, exhausted and happy. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, and she has your stubborn chin somehow. Michael laughed through tears he didn't try to hide. Can I come see her? He asked, not assuming, always asking permission. Room 412, Rachel said. Bring coffee. The hospital stuff is terrible. Michael brought coffee and flowers and a stuffed elephant he'd probably overpaid for at the hospital gift shop. When he walked into that hospital room and saw Rachel holding Emma, saw the tiny, perfect face of this child who carried none of his DNA but all of his hope for the future, something fundamental shifted in his chest. Rachel held Emma out to him, and Michael took her carefully, terrified he'd do something wrong, amazed at how something so small could be so perfect. Hi, Emma, he whispered, and the baby opened her eyes, dark and curious, looking at him like she was deciding whether he was worth trusting. "I'm Michael. I'm the guy who's going to spend the rest of his life making sure you and your mom have everything you deserve." Emma yawned, unimpressed by his promises, and Michael fell completely in love right there. Not just with Rachel anymore, but with this tiny human who'd somehow given him a second chance at being someone better. 6 months after that hospital room meeting, Michael proposed again. Not in some fancy restaurant or romantic vacation spot, but in Rachel's small apartment while Emma slept in the next room and they were both covered in baby spit-up and exhausted from sleepless nights. "Marry me again," he said, no ring yet because he wanted her input this time, wanted to do everything right. Not because of the past, but because of who we've become, because I love you and Emma more than anything, because I want to spend every day proving I'm worthy of you both. Rachel said yes, but slowly, carefully, with conditions about therapy and communication, and never letting pride destroy them again. Michael agreed to everything, would have agreed to anything, just grateful she was willing to risk her heart on him one more time. They got married 9 months later in a small ceremony with just family. No expensive spectacle, just honest vows and Emma as flower girl, throwing petals everywhere except down the aisle. Years later, when people asked Michael about the turning point in his life, he always said the same thing. It wasn't building his first $1 million company or closing his biggest deal. It was the day he walked into a diner and saw the woman he'd destroyed working as a waitress, pregnant and alone, and finally understood what actually mattered. Success wasn't measured in bank accounts or business deals. It was measured in the family waiting for him at home, in Emma calling him daddy even though they shared no blood, in Rachel trusting him with her heart again after he'd broken it so completely. The trust fund he'd set up for Emma stayed untouched, growing with interest, waiting for her 18th birthday. But Emma never needed it, because she grew up with everything money couldn't buy. 2 parents who'd learned the hard way how to love each other properly, who chose each other every day, who built something beautiful from the broken pieces of what they'd lost. And sometimes, late at night when Emma was sleeping and Rachel was reading beside him, Michael would remember standing in that park watching her bus drive away, thinking he'd lost her forever. He'd remember the 2 years of emptiness he'd filled with meaningless success, and he'd be grateful for the second chance he almost didn't get. So that's the story of Michael and Rachel, of how pride and paranoia destroyed something beautiful, and how humility and persistence built something even better from the ruins. Life doesn't always give us second chances, doesn't always let us fix what we've broken. But when it does, when someone extends grace we don't deserve, the only right response is to spend every day proving we're worthy of it. What would you have done in Michael's position? Would you have fought for a second chance or accepted the consequences of your actions? And what about Rachel? Was she right to give him another opportunity? Or should some betrayals be unforgivable? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think about this story. If this story moved you in any way, if it made you think about second chances or forgiveness or the power of humility, do me a favor and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button, because I share stories like this one every week. Stories about real human emotions, about people struggling and surviving, and sometimes finding redemption in unexpected places. Remember, we all make mistakes, some bigger than others. What defines us isn't the mistakes themselves, but what we do after we make them. Do we hide behind pride and pretend we were right? Or do we face our failures with humility and do the hard work of becoming better? Michael chose the second path, and it saved his life. Maybe that's something we can all learn from. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.